Made a rather major decision recently. I successfully recalibrated my expectations. That directly affects everyone here because I'm the writer, the director, the designer, the mechanic, the photographer, editor. Basically every aspect of these videos' creative process revolves around my expectations. So if I change them, it's going to change all of what you see here. I'm always seeking better outcomes for everything I do. I talked my latest plan over with my Patreons, who just received a little extra 14-minute behind-the-scenes video explaining more about this pivot, and I think I found something that'll work for all of us. The feedback I received from them was overwhelmingly positive. I even got complaints that I wasn't charging enough, which is hysterical because everyone's participation there is completely voluntary. I don't set prices. My Patreons just get an extra video bone to chew on from time to time, and that's how it goes. It's more personal than what I do here. But don't ask me what happened to the GSX project. I can't answer that. I haven't given up on it. I'm just not going to leave my mechanical life on pause while waiting for it. We're drowning in Elantra videos, and I love the Elantra. I haven't quit it, but I do need some variety in my life just like the rest of you. The thing I bought 7 years and 100,000 subscribers ago is finally getting its moment in the sun. It's now time. Most of you know what a Galant VR-4 is already. If not, I've got a short playlist for this car story that you might not know about. I'm bringing this rare 30-year-old Mitsubishi back to life. It isn't rare at all in a global sense. These things are all over Europe, Japan, and Australia in right-hand drive. But here in America, only about 3,000 were ever brought to our shores between 91 and 92, and I'd be shocked if even a third of them are left. It sat mostly untouched for the past 15 years. 7 of those have been here in my driveway while I collected things for its restoration. I would have been using this car daily if it could steer. That failed from sitting, but what initially took it off the road was its difficulty of maintenance. If you want to change the oil on this car, you have a nightmare of an exhaust to have to remove and reinstall just to replace the oil filter. The flange is the absolute worst. Many things on this car need attention, but the most significant is the steering system. The first time I started it, it completely drained the power steering system onto the pavement. Aside from that, it's a complete sound running driving car that only needs one of everything. The last thing that happened to it before it was put away in 2006 was a new AC system, a brand new set of tires, and it passed Virginia State inspection. The timing belt's not overdue from a mileage standpoint, but based on the condition of the rubber on the rest of the car, the only right answer is to do a complete timing belt job and a water pump. It's an interference engine and it would be a disaster if it broke, so it has to be done. I always planned to do that job with the engine still installed in the car so that I could demonstrate the same suffering that all of you go through doing it that way. But then I had a good laugh at the idea of other people suffering compared to what it would be like for me to try to film fixing the power steering rack with the engine still in the car. And no lift. No, just no. I don't have any cameras that can even focus in spaces that tight. I'm 99% sure it's the rack that's leaking. There are hydraulic lines going all over the car for the four-wheel steering, and all of those need to be replaced too. Everything I need to fix is extremely difficult to access with the engine in the way. So in order to fix my power steering, why don't we just go ahead and pull this engine and completely rebuild it while we're in there, you know? This is my excuse and reasoning for doing it. For those of you who haven't pulled a drivetrain out of a car before, it seems like an overwhelming and complicated job to take on, but it really isn't. It's just a lot of steps. I'm not going to tell you to drain your fluids. I'm not your dad. You don't have to listen to me. But unless you own stock and kitty litter, you probably should. Your particular car's equipment may vary if it's not this one, so I'll be general here. You typically have 7 major things to have to disconnect to get the engine out. Air, water, fuel, fire, hydros, AC, and something I call metal. Plastic doesn't count. There are no rewards for removing shrouds or clips, just keep track of those things. But for nearly all of the other things, there's a send and a return, an in and an out. While your fluids are draining, remove the battery. Battery is fire. I'm referencing the electrical system as fire, and it too has a send and a return in the form of a power and a ground. But all the electrical connectors on the engine also count as fire. And if you have a Mitsubishi, and there are no bulkhead connectors, then you have to remove all of those too. Removing the intake system clears a path to remove the other things. It makes it look like you did a whole lot really fast, but really all you did was loosen a couple of hose clamps. The intake is one of the airs. Air comes in and it gets farted out the exhaust. There's your in and out. It gets more complicated when you factor in vacuum lines because most of those don't have a send and a return, but they also don't have very much tensile strength either, so if you forget to remove them, they're not going to put up much of a fight. You won't forget them though. Water gets a hot side and a cold side to every component that exchanges heat with the cooling system. But you only have to remove the hoses for the radiator and the heater core if you're removing the whole drivetrain as an assembly. So that's 2 things, 4 hoses. Possibly 6 if you have an automatic transmission. But you should get the radiator assembly out of your way as soon as it's empty, and it'll make this whole job a whole lot easier. You develop other time-saving habits from experience, like putting bolts back in the holes they came from because you hate looking for them later. And for most jobs, short of an engine rebuild, that's a faster and lazier means of bagging and tagging. Moving on. Unless your car is a pile of junk, unless it has 2 fuel systems, or unless it's carbureted, then it has both a fuel send and a return. That's about as complicated as the fuel parts get. Some people remove the rail and injectors and set it aside rather than messing with the hoses at all. I'm not going to do it that way. We're bringing it all with us this time. Pretty quickly, the atrophy shows here. There's a ton of calcium and salt crystals in the coolant passages. Now you see what happens to cars when they sit for a long time. This isn't a mud dollar's nest. This is a high-rise swingers condominium, complete with all the aftermath caused by their degenerate offspring. They trashed the place, man. No respect. I only had an hour and a half of usable light to work with after the day job, but this exhaust kept me out here for an extra 3 hours, fighting 3 stupid fasteners, 3 different sized nuts and bolts that were standard on one side and metric on the other. I wish I was kidding. I worked until my light died, and I managed to get this thing disconnected, but I was a whole lot more determined when I first started out here than I was at this time of the night. I'll come back tomorrow and keep it going. It's the next day. Now, when I say metal, I'm referencing the hard parts that mechanically engage anything on the drivetrain. Things like shift linkage or a speedometer cable if you have a mechanical speed sensor. Axles, carrier bearings, engine mounts, the transfer case. It gets real obvious what those things are as you remove other pieces and clear a path so you can see them better. But if you're thinking engine the whole time, don't overlook the transmission. All-wheel drive 4G63 powered things also have a carrier bearing bolted to the back of the block on the driver's side axle. It has to be unbolted to get that axle out. At least on left-hand drive cars, that's the case. You don't have to do this on the passenger side because that's the short axle. The car uses the same intermediate axle design as on my GSX and that you saw me working with on the Elantra trying to get that to work out. While I pull the other axle, I want to remind newcomers to this kind of job that you always bag and tag everything. Don't just put your parts in a pile because you see me doing it that way. I know all of these parts very well, and I have documentation that almost nobody has if I ever need to figure it out, if I ever need it. For most everyone else, over time, these parts will become less familiar to you, and if my GSX is any kind of a lesson to anyone here, the time frame won't always be in your power to control. The time spent doing that up front can save you a ton of money and headaches later. I got a lot accomplished yesterday, so today I only had to focus on the metals. I recall my GSX engine mount bolts being more accessible than all of these, but I eventually got them loose. I take the roll stop mounts off first. The engine stays put because of the timing and transmission mounts. Wiggling the engine forward and backward makes removing the roll stopper bolts a whole lot easier, but they both need to be loose in order for that trick to be effective. Don't forget your starter. The engine ground strap is on one of the starter bolts, and you could lift the car off the ground before it lets go, so let's go ahead and unbolt it first and move your starter out of the way. Unbolt your AC compressor. Move it as far as you can. The hoses aren't very forgiving. Baling wire is your friend here. Tie it to something on the firewall out of your way. Again, I'm not your dad. You don't have to drain it. You'll wish you did, but I'm not going to make you do it. I just want to encourage you to dispose of it easily the way that doesn't involve a tiresome cleanup. My local landfill recycles automotive fluids for free, and I prefer to do this the responsible way. There's still 2 transfer case bolts I couldn't reach with the exhaust in the way. They're easiest to reach with long extensions and swivel sockets from the driver's side wheel well. And because I got the first 3 bolts in the dark last night, I'm just finishing the rest of what I already started here. If your transfer case is good and rusted on, then it may come loose suddenly and all at once, like this. It's fine. That's not good, but I'm human. You'd celebrate too if you fought this as hard as I did. Remember, it's 30 and I'm almost 20 years older. This pavement isn't getting any warmer either. That's pretty much it. Double check your work before grabbing the hoist. Put your chain on it. Put your jack under it. Take the weight off the timing side engine mount and take it loose. I had to fiddle with it a little bit because one nut was stripped, but with a pry bar and some creativity I managed to get it out without cutting anything. You don't need to completely remove this mount. You can, but it's actually bad if you plan to use it as a lifting point on the hoist like I'm doing here. You could strain and snap the engine mount bolts and drop the engine on the ground if you were that unlucky. There's usually a bracket above the exhaust manifold that you're supposed to be able to use as a lifting point, but many people remove them, and this car is no exception. Hydraulic pumps have a send and return for things like power steering, but they don't have it for things like brakes or hydraulic clutches. We don't need to mess with the brakes, but I just unbolt the slate cylinder and set that part out of the way. It's 2 bolts. It's a lot easier than breaking it loose. Speaking of moving things out of the way, getting near the end of this job here, there's a few structural pieces that you should remove to give yourself some extra clearance. There's a torque plate that's right up against the transmission housing. Big boxes in the front suspension with 5 beefy bolts. The front cross member being the other one. You need to remove the engine at an angle for maximum clearance, and both of these are in the way of letting you do that. Another thing you should remove before going any further is the crank pulley. It gives you 3 extra inches of clearance. Have the transmission mount bolts exposed on the opposite wheel well of the car before you start as well. Don't take them loose yet. The whole drivetrain's hanging from only 1 bolt right now. The timing side mount's just resting against the frame. Before you touch any of those transmission mount bolts, the engine has to be fully supported by your hoist. For about $30 you can buy a load leveler from any auto parts store, and if you're pulling an engine without one, you're either at the junkyard or you're making life really difficult for yourself, and your car really. These let you get the angles necessary to clear everything without destroying anything. Now go ahead and remove the transmission mount. Not just the center bolt, go ahead and remove the whole transmission bracket assembly from both the frame and the transmission. Between removing the crank pulley, the transmission mount, the structural plate, and the cross member below, you now have all the room necessary to droop the butt end of the transmission down into that hole and probably maintain a 6-inch gap to move this thing all around. You'll probably need it, and I'm going to show you why. The average DIY mechanic also has a DIY mechanic's hoist. Add a load leveler to it, and they often don't give you the clearance necessary to get the engine all the way out. If you observe this example, you'll learn 2 things. One is to choke up on the D-rings before you attach the load leveler to your engine to facilitate less chain and more hydraulic cylinder. But if you overestimated your lift capabilities and you didn't change any of these things, then you can find yourself in what appears to be an uncomfortable predicament. I'm hoping to show you how to get out of it. It's actually what the load leveler is for. Rather than bolting the transmission mount back on and partially reinstalling the engine so that you can just put it down and then rechain it, just get the car skinny. And what I mean by this is the car's sitting too high. I didn't do this in the wrong order. I always begin my engine extractions while the car is still up on jack stands because I can access anything on any side of the engine that's still attached. Once you've got the engine free from the mounts and move it a little bit, it's easier to see the zip ties you forgot to cut because they weren't part of the stuff you knew what to look for, or that random hose that you were sure you removed but didn't. After you know it's all done, then you can lower the chassis to the ground instead. Pay attention to where the legs of your hoist and the frame are. It doesn't help you if you set the chassis down on your hoist. I only took 1 wheel off here, but if you had to, and if you have the clearance for your lift, well, you could block it up and set it right on the rotors. The suspension's fully extended all the way to the front end is swinging on a chain right now, so you really won't hurt anything. But this is where the leveler shines. Just change the angle of the engine to get over the hump. This gave me all the wiggle room in the world, and it's out without a scratch. The Galant restoration is officially underway. Pulling an engine is one of the most satisfying jobs of any new project. Doing it this way grants me access to service everything without being bent over this car in my driveway the whole time. We'll be able to easily see the other things, like on the power steering system, that I need to work on, and leave absolutely everything better than we found it. That's my 7 things mental checklist that keeps me from testing the tensile strength of engine components on any car, along with how I get all the extra clearance I need pulling 4G63 drivetrains out of DSMs and JDM cars. Doing it like this prevents me from scratching and banging up the chassis. And if I can do this without help, then so can you. In fact, I'd insist that it's safer. There's less likelihood that someone operates a jack or a hoist while someone else is under the car this way. Many times over, the best help you can have is often an observer. And I thank you all for watching and keeping me safe. I thank all my patrons for keeping me fed, and I'll see you all soon with another update on this project. But until then, stay tubed.